Christ is your prospective customer. And so if you're gonna do false advertising or exaggerate your advertising, guess what? Jesus is on the receiving end.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's get started with today's episode. After the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center, Darren Shearer found that God's work could happen in what are otherwise purely secular places. And today, Darren's showing us how to live a Christ centered work life in a secular setting.
Yeah, I think it starts with recognizing the influence that regardless of whether you're the owner of the company or you're an entry level employee, we all have a different measures of influence to be able to shape the culture of the organization. And as Christ followers, our mission is to make disciples. Whether you're a Christ follower or not, everybody's making disciples in one way or another. And when we all come together, it's our culture that's really discipling people. And the primary place where people are influenced is in their workplace because that's where we spend virtually all of our waking hours. And so how am I defining culture? I'm defining it as that's the defining habits of a group of people. So I say that companies market culture, culture makes disciples, and influencers' habits make the culture. And so for Christ followers, how do we be more Christ centered in our work life? I think our his mission has to be our mission. And so our mission really ought not to just be going to work to make a profit or to feel better about ourselves or all of those things, but we will find more fulfillment. But we do that as our identity is rooted in him. And by extension, our mission is his mission. And that is to make the world look more like Christ and more like the ways of God's kingdom. And that's what I really try to talk about in the book, The Christ Centered Company.
I really appreciate how you're sharing that. Essentially, what you're saying is that you mentioned his mission is our mission, not profit, not necessarily making ourselves feel good, right? And what I hear there is that the profit and the reward of our work is really the result and not the mission.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the mission is make disciples. And that's kind of been restricted in most of our minds to that's just a Christian endeavor. But as I said, a disciple, everybody's a disciple. It's just a matter of who are you following. A disciple, as I define it, as I understand it, is one who has adopted the habits of a culture. And so you can embrace the ways of the world, which are, in the Bible talks about the spirit of the age. And that's something that is ever changing. I mean, the values of the media is saying today are what we really need to be concerned about. And this is what companies really ought to be about and ought to emphasize. And it's always something new, right? Because it's the spirit of the age. But what both you and I are talking about is rooting our companies in our culture and our personal culture, which really starts in the household, is rooting it in the ways of God that are timeless, that really are the way God designed everything to operate. And when you sum it all up, it's all summed up in Christ. I mean, that's God's kingdom you can look to the character and the ways of Jesus and model your professional conduct after him and you can't go wrong from an eternal standpoint.
Wow. You just kind of juxtapose the way Christ asks us to live and the way the world works. In a Christ centered work life, it feels impossible, especially in a world where roles seem to get more and more complex, right? You're really doing three people's jobs, it seems like
Mm.
sometimes. It can feel really impossible. And so, if you're listening right now, you might have a thought or a feeling similar to the thought or feeling that I had as I was reading this book. So, I'm going to ask the question that everyone's thinking. How can we as Christians work in excellence, do everything we got to do at home and at work? And then on top of that, not only bring Christ into our work, but have him be the center of our work life?
I think it starts with what I think of as habit number 1 of these 37 that I talk about, and that is starting with the habit of recognizing that Jesus is on the receiving end of everything that you do in your workplace, in business, in whatever your vocation, whatever your profession is. So he's not just the ultimate judge that we will stand before when we die, but he is the entry level employee. He is your coworker. He's your boss that you might not really like. And that's to say that the way that you relate to those people is exactly how you're relating to Jesus. Christ is your prospective customer. And so if you're gonna do false advertising or exaggerate your advertising, guess what? Jesus is on the receiving end. It doesn't mean that your boss necessarily acts like Jesus, but it does mean that the way that you respond to your boss or the way that you treat your coworkers, the way that you serve your customers is exactly how you're treating Jesus. And so Colossians 3:23 says, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for men, because it's the Lord Christ you serve." And Jesus puts it kind of in a different way when he says, "If you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. If you haven't done it to the least of these, you haven't done it to me." And so certainly he's talking about the materially poor there, but I think in a lot of ways he's talking about everyone, regardless of who you're relating to. Jesus is on the receiving end of that.
Thank you for that. You also mentioned habit too, and I thought that was really interesting. Like, how can we rely on, God's presence, on his power, and on his wisdom to help us bring this to fruition? Like, what does that look like when you have a computer screen in front of you?
Yeah. So the Lord is not just wanting us to work for him, but to work with him. And Paul uses this phrase being we're co-laborers with Christ. And so he wants to partner with us in our work to where we are mindful of him throughout the day. And I know that's a big popular concept out in the workplace now is mindfulness. And a lot of companies are teaching their employees how to be mindful. And so, the question is, what are you setting your mind on during the course of the workday? And, it can take sort of a new agey approach where you just sort of try to empty your mind or, reach some kind of nirvana state while you're working. And we want to have peace of mind. But, without Christ, there is no peace. That means you don't just approach everything with your first snap judgment. A lot of times it's stopping. Maybe I need to take a break from this situation right now and come back with fresh eyes, with a fresh perspective and God's perspective on how I need to proceed, how I need to talk to this person. I mean, Patricia, like me, you may have typed up emails at some point, but then before you hit that send button, the Lord speaks to you and says, "This is this is not the way." You might be
Yeah.
right, you might be right, but this is not wisdom in how to respond to this person right now. And Moses had this mentality. I mean, he said, "If your presence does not go up with us, do not lead us up from here." And so despite having the promise of the promised land, he was willing to not even move into that unless the Spirit of God was with him and guiding the people. And so that's really what we ought to do is to invite God's presence, or what Brother Lawrence called practicing the presence of God throughout the workday. And maybe like for me, that means setting some alarms on my phone where I have these ongoing check-ins with God, so that I don't just approach my work as though God is irrelevant, which is the problem with the way that most of us approach our work, is though God is irrelevant. And what's really irrelevant is what the company says they need from me or what I feel like today. But we've got to have God's perspective all throughout the day.
Mm, that's hard, but I think it's what we're called to do. And it's just a reprioritization. Now, I know there's somebody listening and they're like, this all sounds great, but what if I'm not the owner? What if this isn't a Christian business? What if I'm worried about getting in trouble for, I don't know, using company time for a Bible study and full out evangelism and a revival, right? Like that, some of that comes up a little bit. And I read some of that in your book. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of what we want to do is, and it's the same thing that kind of keeps us boxed in as Christ followers to church is just something that happens inside a building, which was a concept that was really foreign to the church prior to King James introducing this term church into the King James Bible. Because prior to that, it was the ecclesia, which was this is actually a Roman concept, not a Jewish go to the temple kind of a concept. When Jesus talked about on this rock I will build my church, and he uses the word ecclesia, which is the way it's in the original Greek. This was what the Romans would do when they would conquer a new territory, is that they would send a um, a contingent of people into that area that would then bring the culture of Rome, of the empire. And this is what church really is a missional, mobile people. Pick up your cross and follow me. I was thinking about this week. I mean, where did Jesus carry his cross? He carried it down the Via Dolorosa, which was the marketplace. I mean, he literally carried his cross straight through
Mm,
the marketplace, and that's where we carry our cross. So whether you're the owner or not, we are all influencers of the organizations that we work, or they wouldn't be paying you to work there. And so the opportunity and the assignment we have is to help the culture of that organization look more like the kingdom than it did when we got there. And
mm,
and certainly the more leadership and influence you have, the more authority you have to be able to say, you know what, our culture here is to honor God. I mean, you can go into a Chick-fil-A restaurant and it literally says on the plaque that the mission of Chick-fil-A is to be faithful stewards of everything that God has entrusted to us and to have make a positive impact on all who come in contact with Chick-fil-A. And so your company probably has some stated core values that if they're good ones, then there's a biblical basis for it. And so let's say it's integrity, or let's say it's continuous improvement. You can so easily make a connection with the values of God and to then move that forward in your organization. And so it's not about reproducing church service models where we're going to have, and I know that there are companies that actually do this, where they have Bible studies on Wednesdays and basically church services that are optional for employees to attend. But what I'm talking about really is in the things that we're doing when we're doing our job,
mm,
not when we're taking a break, but the causes that we give to philanthropically. But how do we actually handle conflict? How do we actually
mm.
treat customers? That's the stuff that I think God is really most interested in.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's doable. It's not the big scary like let me go in there and turn my workplace into a church. It's very much doable and it sounds like the Lord really wouldn't ask us to do unreasonable things. And in when I was reading, you shared a really comprehensive list of ways that we can live out our faith at work and especially ways that we can make a kingdom impact in a secular environment. And so by leading people in teams, we're able to have that impact just in how we do that. And one of the things that you mentioned was establishing a culture of trust. Can you share why trust is so important and how we, even if we're not owners in business, executives, if we're more leaders of a small team or even individual contributors, why is trust so important and how can we help create a culture of trust?
Yeah. I love how it says in 1 Corinthians 13:7 that love always trusts. So if I love somebody, there's really got to be at least a measure of trust there. I don't think there's a question you could ask somebody that will get more quickly to the heart of their theology than do you believe that God trusts you? Because if you don't believe that God trusts you, then you probably don't really want much to do with God. I mean, if you feel like your boss doesn't trust you, or your spouse doesn't trust you, or somebody that's important in your life doesn't trust you, it's not going to make you want to do better. It's actually going to drive a wedge in the relationship. Think about like on a football field. If a quarterback doesn't trust his receivers, then he's not going to throw the ball to them with any expectation that they're actually going to catch it. But God is not like that, and we really shouldn't be like that because, again, love always trusts. And so when you delegate something to somebody and then wanna micromanage everything they do for, not I'm not talking about just for during a training process, but for years to come, I mean, I think micromanagement is really unbiblical because it's evidence that you don't actually trust your people. And in a sense, there's a lack of love for that person, and they're not going to be able to grow in an environment where there's little to no trust.
Mm. There was a book or a leader, someone I was talking to, I cannot remember what it was, but they had mentioned something along the lines of if you give someone a challenge, they'll rise to the occasion. But if you're constantly telling them what to do and what not to do, they'll actually fall to the level of your micromanaging.
Yes. Yeah, that's
Interesting.
that's exactly right. They're gonna fall to the level of your trust is another way of I think
Mm,
of saying that, and I think that's why we have a lot of burnout among leaders is
mm,
because there's just a refusal to let go of things, and, I
mm,
love how John the Baptist said, "He must increase, I must decrease." Well, the
mm.
way I really see Jesus increasing is through other people. He doesn't typically increase when I'm trying to do more than really I ought to be doing. He increases as I disciple others. Again, it goes back to that idea of making disciples in the workplace because the individuals will come and go, but that culture is what's going to remain and influence everyone who comes in contact with that organization going forward.
Oh, there's so much there. Just right now, what you mentioned is sort of the impact. And you don't have to be a leader, but especially when you're a leader, your influence reverberates. Like there's ripple effect that it affects people's lives. And you have to ask yourself, does your interaction with other people, does your leadership affect people negatively or positive? There's always an impact. Is it
Yeah.
positive or negative? And you when you mentioned burnout, I think it goes both ways with the micromanager and also with the team because burnout's really it's not about how much time you spend at work, it's about whether your energy is negative or positive during that time and how you feel about yourself. And so I think burnout has a lot to do with that lack of trust in yourself, lack of trust in others, and it's just you're working too hard to try to control something that maybe isn't in your control.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And I think some of it too is that causes us to be micromanagers is laziness.
Mm,
It's like I don't want to spend the time on the front end to really help make sure that we have a clear process. And instead, I'm just going to wait for them to mess up and then I can just reinforce my perception of that person that they're just incompetent when in reality we've got a log in our own eye when we're trying to take the speck out of somebody else's eye. Moses' father-in-law saw that Moses was personally judging all of the cases for all of Israel out there in the wilderness. He's like, "You're gonna wear yourself out." Like, the Bible
mm,
literally says that
mhm.
and says, you need to delegate. You need to appoint some other judges. And then he says you need to also establish standards. Well, the law had not yet been given, and it's really interesting because the very next couple of verses, Moses is up on Mount Sinai, and God is giving the law. And so
Mhm.
now the people have some standards to follow. To delegate properly, I mean, you've gotta have a process that's clearly defined, and maybe it's that person's job, that you've delegated to. Maybe there is no process, and it's gonna be that person's assignment to really develop that process and document it. But yeah, that's what we try to do
Mhm.
in our company is, I mean, really document everything. I mean, screencasts, tutorials, and all of that.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, that was really good. Thank you for that. Okay, so this next question, it might meet a little bit of resistance because everyone wants a high performing team. And so I always think there's this deeply ingrained idea that more work equals better performance. And
Mm,
so, especially now that I'm starting a business very selfishly. I'm asking this question partly for myself, but also for folks that, I work with a lot of people who are coming out of a really overworked situation. And so both they and I believe in rest and fighting the battle for having rest each week. And so I think the question here is, how can we implement both the rest that you recommend and being a high achieving team or a high performing team? How do you bring those two together?
Well, I think a good place to start is to take a Sabbath day of rest. I mean, this is one of the 10 commandments, right? And right up there with thou shalt not murder. So it's there for good reason. And just a practical reason is you've got margin in your life. And most of us don't have that. And so maybe we work Monday through Saturday. And then, oh, yeah, I take Sunday off, but Sunday just happens to be the day that I'm mowing the lawn or I'm doing all the laundry or I'm doing all of my household work. But actually it's not a day of rest at all. And so we have to have margin in our lives. And I mean, Chick-fil-A has obviously set a great example with this in closing every Sunday so their team members can rest. And yet that's one of the highest grossing days of the week for most restaurants. But they've had more than 47 consecutive years of sales increases. And so you can build margin in and still excel and lead your industry. And Chick-fil-A really is the leader in the fast food industry in terms of just their use of technology and their service standards and all of those things. But yeah, I would say between having a Sabbath day of rest and refusing to be a micromanager, I think we're all going to be a lot better off.
Oh my goodness, absolutely. Those are the 2 most important. No, but that was really good because, you know, Chick-fil-A is just a great example, but I think that, can occur really anywhere. It's if you are listening and you're of the faith, then you believe what the word says. And the word says, unless the Lord builds the house, the laborers work in vain. And so
Yeah.
it's one of those pieces where it's like, if you truly believe what the word says, then the word says, even God himself took a break. And, I think it's in, you're gonna know this more than I do, but I think it's either like in Deuteronomy or Exodus where God gives the commandment of the Sabbath. He starts to kind of explain this is like he literally commands us not to work as a form of worship. And I had a hard time with this because I can work like the best of them. And so
Mhm.
it comes to Sunday and I'm like, oh, I just got to do this. I just got to do that. And one day I got this kind of like nudge from the Holy Spirit. Do you or do you not trust me that I have built in enough time for you to work 6 days, have one day of rest, and that I would still make happen, right? That I would bless the work that you've done the other 6 days. And that was just like a form of trust and a form of worship. And so that to me, that hit really hard is
Yeah.
rest is trust.
Yeah.
Um,
That's
so
right. And for any of the listeners who have a team, it also says part of that law there is that your workers would also be taking a Sabbath. And of course, you can't force your team members to take a day off, but you can avoid sending them emails on their day off. You
mm,
can, I mean, there's email schedulers where sometimes I'll do this if I know that my team member is taking a day off, I'll schedule it to come in their inbox on Monday, not on Saturday or Sunday, when they're or on their vacation day. So that's
mhm.
something else to consider and why culture is so critical because if you're the only one in your organization that's trying to have some margin and trying to take a Sabbath where it's not just work yourself to death kind of a culture, it's going to be really hard. And you might, if you're in that kind of a culture, then and God isn't calling you to be the one to really instill a culture of rest for the team members, then you might need to go someplace else.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's when you start to consider, is this the right place? Because you mentioned influence in the beginning, which can be used for good. And we're talking about that today, but it could also be used for bad. Like there's, environment plays a really, really big role. We've talked a lot about what it means like to live a Christ-centered life and how we can impact and influence and help people in our day-to-day without necessarily having to reinvent the wheel or turn our business places into a full-on, church or ministry. And so as we start to wind down here, the habit that struck me most when thinking about all this was when you mentioned providing emotional and spiritual care for your team. Now, I
Mm.
talk about this with clients all the time, both the repercussions when it's not done and the lasting impact for work and for life when it is. So, what could providing spiritual care for your team, like and emotional care too, what does that look like when you're a faith driven leader in a secular environment?
So the Christ-centered company with these 37 biblical business habits, there's an assessment that goes along with that. And we've had, hundreds of Christian business influencers take this assessment. Most are owners of the company, but not all. Some are leaders of the company that are they're scoring their company in these different areas. And the one that's consistently rated at the very bottom is this habit 22, providing emotional and spiritual care for your team. And there's probably a variety of reasons for that. But I think what it comes down to is, as leaders, as influencers, we just feel like it's not our job to do that. Maybe that's the job of a counselor or the job of a pastor, or that's somebody else's job. And yet they're not going to a counselor. They're not going to church. Maybe they're not getting it at home either. And the only person that's going to provide that care for them, really most cases, that is going to be you as that person's coworker or their boss. And so Galatians 6:2 says, bear one another's burdens and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. I mean, where do we primarily do that? I mean, yeah, you'll hear about loss in the family of people at church, and everybody goes to the funeral, but who goes to the funeral of your coworker's mom or
Mm,
your coworker's spouse or child? Or And so one of the ways that companies have tried to address this is by bringing in corporate chaplains,
mm,
and because it can get a little awkward when you start to um, for a supervisor to have conversations with their team member that could potentially be a negative reflection on that team member, and now they feel like this is gonna negatively reflect on their performance reviews, and they're just gonna be looked at differently. There's got to be wisdom applied here, but we do need to, whether you're a trained chaplain, counselor, pastor, whatever, we need to find out how our team members are doing. I love what Regent Bank does. They have an inbox that people can email their prayer requests, and they have
mm,
80 of their employees who actually respond to these prayer requests and personally pray for these prayer requests that come in from people in the company and even people outside of the company. It's really incredible. But asking your team members how you can pray for them, they don't need to give you specifics. Like, I mean, they might just say, we're going through my kid's going through a hard time right now. I'm just going to leave it at that. And and now you've got something that you can pray for, and your team member knows that you actually care about them as a person and not just what they can do for you.
mm. Yeah, and there's simple ways like that. Sometimes we think it has to be something really involved, but it can be something really small and simple that can make a really big difference. Okay, so let's do a really quick speed round here. Imagine that you've got a ton of people. I mean, like everyone is here listening to you, but you only have about a minute for each of these questions. Number one, what's the single most important habit that we need to remember and why?
Yeah, it'd be habit number 1, recognizing that Jesus is on the receiving end, because if you're in a conflict with somebody and you just view that person on the receiving end of whatever you're gonna dish out and how you're gonna respond to what they did to you, you're
Mm,
not gonna handle that in a Christ-like way. But when you know that Jesus is on the receiving end, you're gonna wanna partner with him and handle it his way.
mm. That was good. All right. Number two, what is a myth or mistake that you see most frequently in the workplace?
A myth or mistake. Yeah, maybe it's with this habit 22 because it is consistently rated at the very bottom of the barrel, where I guess we feel like it's not our job to provide emotional and spiritual care for team members. That's the job of a pastor. I'm just here to make sure that person gets enough widgets produced every day, and I'm going to fire them if they don't. And yet they're people. They're not just robots. So I think that's the myth, is that it's somebody else's job. Well, guess what? To bust that myth, nobody else is doing that job for almost every one of your coworkers.
Mm, no one else is doing that job, so you should be the hands and feet. This is great. Okay, let's wrap it up with this last question. If you could speak directly to all Christian leaders, all Christian professionals in the world today, what would you tell them?
I would say that your mission in your workplace is not just to make money or to feel good about yourself, to just use your gifts and talents, although those things are important. Those things are really valuable. Your mission really is to be an ambassador for Christ, to cultivate a Christ-centered culture in that organization, even if the owners are not on board with that. And again, this is not about trying to start a church service in the break room. This is about out in the actual factory floor and behind the counter when you're talking and interacting with customers, and when you're upset with team members. And I mean, that's where disciples are made. And that's why we see Jesus so frequently out in those workplace contexts, and why the main character in nearly all of his parables is a resource manager of some sort, and where all of his miracles virtually happen in the marketplace, because that's where the people are. And we have an incredible opportunity to actually see the Great Commission fulfilled in the way that we do our jobs.
Mm. Thank you for that. Listen, friend, if you're like me and you love a good book, you will want to check out Darren's book, The Christ Centered Company, and it has 37 biblical business habits to honor God and bless the world. But Darren, I know that you're not only an author, and I'd love for you to really quickly share all you do and how people can find you and work with you.
Yes. So I write books, but I also publish books for a living. And through our company, Highbridge Books, we've published over 210 books at this point. And these are Christ-centered books. And they're not necessarily Christian books, but they are books written from a Christian perspective. Some of them are industry specific. Some of them are addressing specific issues going on in the culture. So if you have a book that you would be interested in getting published, definitely reach out to me. You can go to hybridgebooks.com and see what we have to offer. I'd love to have that conversation.
Absolutely. So I'll drop those links or that link in the description. And you can also find Darren on LinkedIn as well. And I'll put that link in the description too. And before we go, if you are in the US and you need a LinkedIn review for your upcoming search, go ahead and connect with me as well. Let me know you're there for the review. I'll get that out to you. Now, listen, if you're in the middle of a career search, maybe you need work that matches your values, or maybe you've been ready for the next move and now's the time, meet up with me here next week, same time. We'll go over 10 resume success markers that hiring managers look for. Until then, know that we're praying for you, we're cheering you on, and we'll see you on the next one. Hey, thanks for listening. I really appreciate you spending time with me today. If you found this episode helpful, please tap the 5-star review on the show's homepage in your podcast app. It would absolutely make my day, and it helps others discover the Uncommon Career Podcast. Now, to download your free career resources and learn how I help seasoned professionals land amazing offers in as little as 90 days, click on the link in the description or go to theuncommoncareer.com. Thanks again, and I'll see you on the next one.